Over the last few weeks, we've taken a closer look at the stories, laws, and prophetic utterances that make up the majority of the Old Testament's pages. What remains for us is a handful of books that stand out as outliers to these big categories. Each of these 5 books is so unique in the interpretive issues it presents that it makes sense to discuss them individually. We're going to begin today with the book of Proverbs. Proverbs belongs to a genre of writings known as wisdom literature. Wisdom literature focuses not on theory or abstract knowledge, but on practical insights for living well in a variety of circumstances. Knowledge is understanding how the internet works. Wisdom is recognizing whether or not to put up that post you can post at 2 a.m. The book of Proverbs offers pithy, tweet-style wisdom for living. My first personal favorite bit of wisdom from Proverbs comes from Proverbs 17:28. Even fools may be thought wise and intelligent if they stay quiet and keep their mouths shut. I've applied this insight to great effect in a variety of real-world settings. There are also some great little zingers in Proverbs. Like, a gold ring in a pig's nose is a beautiful woman who lacks discretion. Wisdom might often also mean thinking carefully about when and where you pull that one out. The fundamental insight of Proverbs is that the world has a definite God-given shape, a way that it was designed to operate. You can either live in alignment with that shape or in defiance of it. I've occasionally been known to defy an engineer's instructions by ironing a shirt while wearing it. But sooner or later, defying the design tends to catch up with you, often painfully. The point of wisdom is to teach you to live more successfully in greater alignment with the world's true shape. We've previously noted that different literary genres communicate different kinds of truth. This is especially important to remember when it comes to the Proverbs. You might find a proverb that says something like this. The Lord's blessing makes a person rich, and no trouble is added to it. Or this, instruct your children, they will give you peace of mind and bring delight to your life. You might read these proverbs and think to yourself, have you seen my life? Have you met my kids? That simply isn't true. Does that mean that God's word through the Proverbs has failed? The answer lies in recognizing what kind of truth a proverb tells. Proverbs do not speak with the voice of a promise from God. They aren't immutable laws like gravity that have to hold true everywhere and at all times. Proverbs are generalized truths. They can tell you how the world works, all things being equal. But of course, things are not always equal, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised that even solid principles have exceptions. Proverbs are intended to guide, to advise, and to prompt serious reflection. They aren't written to guarantee outcomes. As we seek to live in greater alignment with the world's true shape, it's also worth keeping in mind that the world's shape is frequently complex, and therefore that oversimplified answers don't serve us well. Wisdom involves not only knowing something is true, but also knowing when that truth applies and when it doesn't. For example, Proverbs 26:4 says, "Don't answer fools according to their folly, or you will become like them yourself." The very next verse instructs, "Answer fools according to their folly, or they will deem themselves wise." Part of wisdom is recognizing where one truth ends and another truth begins. According to Proverbs, disobedience to God leads to suffering. However, it's also true that sometimes the disobedient get rich and happy, at least for a while. And sometimes obeying God leads to suffering. Sometimes when tragedy strikes, it might be wise to stop looking for reasons, why me, and simply grieve. Other times, it might be wise to observe a pattern that bad things tend to follow excessive alcohol usage and adjust your lifestyle accordingly. In our eagerness to defend the truth, what often happens is we double down on one truth we recognize and we miss a corresponding truth on the other side. But multiple truths can be operative at the exact same time. Any truth applied to the wrong situation can become a falsehood. The right thing done at the wrong moment can be the wrong thing. Wisdom requires taking the whole picture into account. One of the keys to interpreting a proverb is to be sure that you hold the insight of any one line in the context of the whole picture. Sometimes multiple proverbs may expose each other's limits, or might reveal corresponding truths that exist in a kind of productive tension with each other. When you read a proverb, take the time to both observe the generalized truth it communicates and to consider its possible limits. When you feel a sense of tension between two proverbs, don't panic. Instead, remember that wisdom is often found in the tension of two true and youthful principles pulling against each other. Let's shift now to consider the book of Psalms. Many people I know consider Psalms to be their favorite book of the Bible. The Psalms compose ancient Israel's songbook. This book includes songs sung in worship, songs for the coronation of a king, psalms to express grief, songs that tell stories from history, even songs that celebrate the capital city of Jerusalem. More than 1/3 of the Bible, including the Psalms, is made up of poetry. This might seem rather extraordinary, since most of us today don't tend to read a lot of poems. But poetry has a lot of benefits. For one, it's easy to memorize. Just think about how many song lyrics you know by heart. It's effective at capturing emotion, which sometimes stirs us into action. And it's very good language for expressing truths, big truths, that ordinary language can't always wrap itself around. Different cultures compose poetry rather differently. English poetry commonly uses rhymes or meter to create rhythms of sound. But ancient Hebrew poetry, like the Psalms, is poetry that works by creating balances of thoughts or ideas. One of the things you might notice reading the Psalms is that thoughts tend to travel in pairs. In many cases, the second line repeats or slightly expands the first. Listen for how this is happening in Psalm 103. The Lord works righteousness, does justice for all who are oppressed. God made his ways known to Moses, made his deeds known to the Israelites. The Lord is compassionate and merciful, very patient and full of faithful love. God won't always play the judge. He won't be angry forever. He doesn't deal with us according to our sin or repay us according to our wrongdoing. Did you notice in that reading how each line is paired with a second line that articulates a similar thought, just in a slightly different way? The key thing to keep in mind as an interpreter is that the meaning of the two lines is tied together. The psalmist is not referring to God's righteousness and God's justice as two separate things, but as the same quality being expressed two different ways. In some cases in the Psalms, a second line will set up a deliberate contrast with the first. For example, Psalm 34:10. Even strong young lions go without and get hungry, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. One of the primary tools of poetry is metaphor. A metaphor describes something by comparing it to something else. For example, Psalm 91:4 says, "God will protect you with his pinions. You'll find refuge under his wings." God does not literally possess wings or feathers, but the psalmist is using the metaphor of a mother bird, hiding hatchlings under her wing, to offer a vivid, comforting picture of God's commitment and God's power to protect. The key to interpreting a metaphor is to ask yourself what key qualities these two things have in common. Psalm 18:2 says, "My God is my rock." Well, how is God like a rock? Strong, unchanging, safe? But every metaphor also has a breaking point where the comparison ceases to hold. For example, rocks are generally silent and unresponsive, but that's not God at all. A lot of misunderstanding can result if we push a metaphor too far and we don't pay attention to its natural breaking point. We've suggested before that there are many different kinds of psalms in the Bible. And you might be surprised to learn that the most common kind of psalm is a lament. Some laments are expressions of private pain. Others are written for public mourning of corporate tragedies. Many laments begin with raw expressions of grief and anger, but eventually turn a corner toward faith and hope in God. A few laments trail off into questioning silence. There's even a category of psalm called imprecatory or cursing psalms that call on God's judgment against enemies. The important thing to keep in mind with psalms, like with the Proverbs, is what kind of truth we're receiving. The psalms reflect human emotions and experiences, faith and despair, directed toward God as a form of prayer. They're full of testimonies to God's faithfulness. But they're not promises, nor is every word or emotion they contain necessarily endorsed. If that's the case, you might wonder how the Psalms function as God's word to us. I'd say that first, the Psalms invite us into a relationship with God that's personal and open. The Psalms don't just offer bits of truth about God, but also deeply human truths about what it feels like to search for God in places of darkness. The Psalms offer inspired permission to present ourselves and our emotions honestly to God, without the need to hide or sanitize. They don't even just give us permission. Sometimes the Psalms can help us find our words when our words run dry. The truth of human experience is that we can't always wrap our grief quickly back into expressions of hope. The truth of human experience is that sometimes we're hurt in ways that seem to demand a fast and brutal response. When a psalm of lament expresses despair, it doesn't mean that there really is no hope. When a cursing psalm calls out for vengeance, it doesn't mean God will comply. But when we speak these feelings out loud, we're naming the reality of evil and we're inviting God's intervention. We're casting our anger and despair into the hands of God, trusting that God will deal with those feelings justly. And as we name the truth of where we are now, we're also opening ourselves to God's transforming power. The books of Job and Ecclesiastes are some of my personal favorites to read. These two books have a few important things in common. They are speculative literature, which means they're books that grapple with some of the biggest mysteries of life and faith. And each of these books in its own way challenges conventional wisdom. Listen to this delightful opening from the book of Ecclesiastes. "Perfectly pointless," says the teacher. "Perfectly pointless. Everything is pointless. What do people gain from all the hard work that they work so hard at under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains as it always has. The sun rises, the sun sets, it returns panting to the place where it dawns. The word that my Bible has translated as pointless here is the Hebrew word hevel. Your Bible might translate this word as meaningless or transient, but the word hevel literally means vapor. Vapor. Everything is vapor. The author's point here is that life is fleeting and nothing truly lasts. No matter what you achieve, the chances are that your great-grandkids won't even remember your name. History just seems to go in circles. After breaking down the futility of absolutely everything in life, the author of Ecclesiastes finally declares this in chapter 8. I commend enjoyment, because there's nothing better for people to do under the sun but eat, drink, and be glad. This message seems so deeply in tension with other parts of the Bible that it's difficult to know what to make of it. Some people believe that the key to interpreting it lies in the last two sentences of the book of Ecclesiastes. So this is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Worship God and keep God's commandments, because this is what everyone must do. God will definitely bring every deed to judgment. The 12 long chapters of Ecclesiastes that dance around with despair are ultimately just brushed off at the end as wrong, and conventional Old Testament piety is reaffirmed. The difficulty with reading this way is you might find the author has made the case for futility too convincing over the previous 12 chapters to dismiss this easily. Many Christians ultimately view Ecclesiastes as a kind of foil to the gospel. In other words, the despair and the futility that the author of Ecclesiastes observes is only ultimately answered by Jesus. The promise of resurrection gives history a direction and choices real lasting meaning. The meaning of the book changes when the hevel of the world is viewed in light of Jesus. But recognizing Ecclesiastes as wisdom literature also means taking its uncomfortable insights about existence seriously. The reminder of mortality and of the fleeting nature of success might invite us to examine the daily choices we're making. As wisdom, Ecclesiastes encourages us to consider carefully what we're seeking to achieve. And it reminds us to show up to life's good gifts that are as precious as they are fleeting. If Ecclesiastes focuses its speculation on the meaningfulness of existence, the book of Job explores the mystery of suffering and God's presence in it. As with Ecclesiastes, there's a distinct tension between the conclusions of Job and the messages of many other Old Testament books. The Old Testament law frequently states that God is just, and therefore that God deals with people as they deserve. In terms of the Deuteronomy covenant, you might say that blessings come to the righteous and curses to the unrighteous. The prophets themselves say, if you turn toward God, God will turn toward you. Now, Job is suffering terribly, and throughout the book, Job's devout friends attempt to explain his painful circumstances. Their explanations are, for the most part, deeply biblical, drawing on many statements and insights that are common to the Old Testament law and prophets. The problem is that in Job's case, none of these insights apply. The book of Job exposes the holes in existing Old Testament wisdom. It points out the limits of all of the accepted answers to the problem of suffering. those conventional religious answers might hold true in many situations. But it turns out that some experiences defy all explanation. Everything we say about them simply proves false. What the book of Job offers in the place of other answers is not new certitudes, but an encounter. An encounter with the power and the presence of a living God whose wisdom and whose judgment are vastly beyond human fathoming. The book of Job puts a useful check on religious arrogance and intellectual overreach. Job's behavior offers implicit permission to speak boldly with God, to wrestle and argue the case from our point of view. God isn't offended or put off by Job's protests. In fact, the only thing that does seem to offend God is the insistence of Job's friends on clinging to simplistic answers in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. But at the end of the day, the book of Job also offers us a reminder of the limits of human vision and perspective. It observes how ill-equipped even the wisest person is to grasp what the whole picture of creation and history amounts to. It notes the outer limits of religious truths, and it invites a humbled, respectful silence before the mysteries of God's providence and power. The final Old Testament book we're going to touch is pretty much the furthest thing from Job that we can imagine in both subject and style. The presence of Song of Songs in the Bible has been so uncomfortable for both Jews and Christians that there were times early on when both groups argued about whether it should even be considered a sacred text. I mean, in what way does erotic poetry serve as a word from God? Some historically have tried to solve the dilemma of this epic poem's presence in the Bible by reading it allegorically. In fact, many famous interpreters through history have suggested that this book should be understood as a kind of elaborate representation of the love that exists between God and Israel, or between God and the church, even God and the human soul. Lest we dismiss that idea too hastily, it's worth noting that metaphors of romance are used in other books of the Bible, like Hosea and Isaiah, to explore the relationship between God and the people of faith. But the difficulty in this case is that the name of God isn't mentioned even once in the whole book of Song of Songs. It seems that this book is exactly what it appears to be: one couple's story of passionate mutual pursuit. Within the realm of wisdom that we've been exploring today, Song of Songs celebrates the goodness of love and sex within God's plan for creation. This may, in fact, be a particularly valuable contribution to the biblical canon, at a time when conversations around sexuality are often caught between a kind of toxic cultural cheapening and reactive religious shame. Song of Songs preserves within the Bible a starting point for thinking about a Christian sexual ethic of real mutual empowerment and self-giving, where each party honors the body of the other as if it were their own.